Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yeah. This morning, I was here on time.
Dear Nikita, Dhawan, dear Thomas Krüger, dear Wolfgang Kaleck, dear Joachim Bernauer, dear guests from abroad, dear scholars, dear artists, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very, very happy and deeply thankful that you agreed to come to this platform following the invitation of Nikita Dhawan and Academy of the Arts to participate in Platform 3 of the program Colonial Repercussions under the title Planetary, Utopias, Hope, Desire, Imaginaries in a Post-Colonial World. At this moment, it's very important for me to say that for the Academy of the Arts, it's an incredible challenge and an incredible chance to be able to host this Platform 3. And in fact, we are talking about a long-term project which started in 2016 with the idea, what are the capacities and the possibilities for transformation of institutional thoughts and practice, especially practice. I'm so happy that Nikita Dhawan agreed to take over the responsibility for Platform 3. And before Nikita will open the platform, we have our deep friends and good friends who are helping us to do everything. I just have to be to thank Thomas Krüger for the public. No, I have always to see the English translation of Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung. It's Federal Agency for Civic Education, who made it able to realize this program, not only because he supported the ideas and the method of working together, but also giving money into it. And the same for Joachim Bernauer, who is the head of cultural department in Goethe-Institut in Munich, who did the same. He was always in a process with us to develop this platform here and to reflect it to the institutes worldwide. And I'm very happy that also 25 directors of institutes, especially from Africa, are here and thinking with us about what we could change in our practices and in our hierarchies. And of course, I am very happy that Wolfgang Kaleck is coming here. He took the responsibility for the first platform, which was in January and which has strong repercussions because the discussion with the Herero activists here in Platform 1 is coming back to us via the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because there is the question how we deal with a German reading on a very concrete colonial past. And as an institution of the arts, we are able to go different ways, and we will go on. And for sure, it's not ended up with this third platform. And I'm very, very much looking forward to hear the interventions and to be part of the process. Thank you very much. Thomas.
Dear Nikita Dhawan, dear Johannes, dear Wolfgang, dear audience, wealth is not a fruit of labor, but result of organized, protected robbery. Allow me to sum up these words of Frantz Fanon's in Wretched of the Earth as follows: nobody is free of guilt. Let me rephrase colonialism as a brutal materialization of power, as exploitation and systematic oppression brought about the racialization. Our endeavors to analyze the repercussions of colonialism are not about righting past wrongs. Even today, the political, legal, and psychological efforts to reprocess colonial crimes are still in their infancy. Instead, the objective is to create awareness of the fact that the power structures of the past have an impact on the present. They have an impact on today's global power relations that are deeply entrenched in society. It is therefore high time that major institutions such as Academy of Arts and Federal Agency for Civic Education, as my institution, launch an event like the present one. That they open the doors and minds to voices that have for decades been criticizing the post-colonial illiteracy that dominates in German society. Decades of ignorance and active forgetting lie behind us. In the current climate of new and revived nationalism and blatant racism, it is more urgent than ever that we take a stand against the right-wing attempts to shift the debate. Moreover, we as wide parts of German society need to critically scrutinize of our racist structures and socialization by broadening our own perspectives, our way of thinking and outlook, or in Toni Morrison's words, to shift the critical gaze from the observed to the observers and unlearn white privilege and racism as harmful structures for all sides. Needless to mention in this context here that the nation building of the 19th century went hand in hand with the rise and institutionalization of racism that had served European societies already in prior centuries in order to colonize, oppress, exploit, enslave, and kill people. What is missing in current debates around migration is an insistence on the century-long unequal entanglements between European societies, actors, capital, and knowledge, and the spaces they conquered, colonized, and exploited. And therefore, interventions such as the present one are so important. Contemporary migratory flows reflect the persistent inequalities caused by centuries of European colonial dominance. Sivananden's famous claim from the 80s, "We are here because you were there," has not lost its relevance. The multifaceted nature of the continuous imbalance of power expressed in the sentence make it essential to take a clear stance. It is important not only that we call our injustice, inequality, and racism in our society, but also that we make an active contribution towards stopping them. That goes for all parts of society, including governmental institutions. We, the ones privileged by these structures, have to learn to think in an anti-racist way. The aim is not only to condemn open racism and hatred, but to ask who benefits from which privileges in society and on what grounds. A key element of that is to render problematic knowledge and seek to unlearn the epistemic violence, to quote Gayatri Spivak, who will speak here tomorrow, implemented by colonialism. And this level is crucial for us as civic educators, because racism affects how we see ourselves, others, and the world. To overcome racist structures, we must question and break down the knowledge categories we take for granted. Against the backdrop, a multiplicity of perspective gains new significance. It provides the foundation for a decolonization process across all segments of society. Decolonization must be about weaving new threads into the social narrative, about breaking down Eurocentric single stories, as Chimamanda Adichie has postulated, and devising new forms of the social and the political. Utopia is a society free of any manifestation of racism. Those oppressed by racist and colonial power structures have from the outset been resisting their exploitation. They have provided us with methods, knowledge, and tools that have been available for us for years. They have insisted on research into racism, gender issues, and post-colonialism. We, the ones who are seemingly profiting from these structures, obviously just haven't been that interested. We must stop thinking that we are taking a risk when we give a political voice to those who have been deprived of it. We are content in the comfortable knowledge that we do, after all, run numerous anti-racism programs and contribute to the much-vaunted efforts to educate the public. But we need to simultaneously expose institutional and structural discrimination and develop awareness of the contradictory nature of our own actions. We need to avoid a selective view at our historical responsibility and stop to ignore the continuous global inequalities that we currently see on a daily basis in news. If we are aware of narratives, the power structures and their continued existence and evolution, then we must tackle them and bring attention to them loudly and unequivocally. In doing so, we leave behind us the sense of certainty, stability, security, and direction we once knew in order to work together on building something new. Where there is no agitation, there can be no education. Where there is no uncertainty, there can be no certainty. Where there is no empathy, there can be no solidarity. I'm therefore deeply grateful to the promising program that Professor Nikita Dhawan has put together. It brings together some of the major protagonists of critical post-colonial, decolonial, and anti-racist thinking and activism who have for decades been insisting on the need to confront persistent colonial inequalities on all levels. Your expertise and your interventions are urgently needed. I'm looking forward to the debates and dialogues on the exciting panels of this symposium, and I hope to learn and unlearn a lot. I wish you and us productive symposium and engaged discussions on the most pressing issues of our time. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, everybody. You might ask yourself why to talk about law and lawyers, because lawyers and the law were in the past and in the present rather part of the problem than part of the solution. And you're right to ask yourself that, and you're right to state that. We had organized this conference with some of the most important voices from a group called TWAIL, Third World Approaches Towards International Law. And some might think that it has been a rather academic or historical debate. But let me give you 3 quotes, all from this year, from official German voices. First, the German Museum Association released some guidelines in this spring after Macron's speech. And the lawyers would say there, the present-day legal system does not provide for appropriate instruments to resolve property questions related to acquisitions from colonial context. Second example, the research service of the German Federal Parliament on the Herero genocide case, I quote, the commonly shared conviction of the international legal community, however, excluded from their perspective uncivilized indigenous people also from the minimum human rights standards. Third quote, the lawyers of the Federal Republic of Germany in the US District Court case, the Over Herero case against Germany, would write in one of their letters to the court, history cannot be rewritten as far as its legal framework is concerned. Legal rules change as time goes by, but the law of the 21st century cannot be introduced back more than 110 years in history. That comes very close to a very infamous saying of a German politician, what used to be law in the past cannot be unlawful in the present. Was damals Recht war, kann heute kein Unrecht sein, said former CDU Minister President Filmiger, who was a Nazi judge and tried to defend his activities. He had to step back as a politician. But nobody is talking about to apply the same standards German courts very much too late, on a very small level, applied at least to some degree to the Nazi times, and also in the 1990s to the GDR system. So there are legal solutions, but not only in the past, but also in the present, lawyers tend to act as apologists of the post-colonial status quo. I'm not going into details, but I would like to call upon you to join the political and legal struggle for justice. It's a very concrete struggle. We have to define colonialism, and especially its cruelest chapters, like the German genocide in Namibia, as crimes against humanity. We have to draw concrete legal consequences out of this, and that means reparation, especially for the Herero and Nama in Namibia in their case against Germany, and that means they have to participate in the negotiations, and they have to get appropriate reparation, and that has to include the land question, and that has to include the control over natural resources. And one of the also very needed consequences is the restitution of robbed arts and human remains, and that means we have to urge German institutions like the museums and other institutions to give back what doesn't belong to them. Thank you very much.
Hello and good afternoon. In the name of the Goethe-Institut, I would like to welcome you, and I'm very thankful that we can be here and to confirm that the Akademie der Künste certainly is one of our most important partners here in Germany. We have worked on very related topics, like a conference called Rethinking Cosmopolitanism, or an exhibition, Nothing to Declare, or a conference, Public Spaces, Fights and Fictions. So it comes in a series, and so I'm very happy that you approached us, Johannes Odenthal and Judith Weber, to cooperate in this conference. So what matters in the context of colonial repercussions or the colonial heritage for the Goethe-Institut? What is the Goethe-Institut in this context? Some of you know it well, some of you don't know it. The Goethe-Institut is a private institution. It is funded by the German government. So it's civil society, but funded, and it is independent. So its independency is very important when it comes to the work we are doing abroad. And of course, on a very early stage, the Goethe-Institut developed its principles. Of course, quality, innovation, sustainability matter, but what matters first and foremost is to work in partnership, to listen to our partners and to work in partnerships. And this comes with a critical attitude towards our environment and towards ourselves. So we have to question ourselves, of course, about our whiteness, about the state, how the way we work in the world. And so if the first characteristics, I would say, is civil society and the officially funded independency, we have the partnership and the self-criticism. And thirdly, the Goethe-Institut is a network of networks. It's a global network. There are more than 150 institutes around the world, but all of them are local networks. So it's local. There are these local institutions. And so this is a great responsibility that comes when we work with an institution like the Akademie der Künste. So really to see what we have listened, what we have learned outside Germany, and what can we bring to this discussion here. And I have brought a long list, and I have brought a short list, what the Goethe-Institut is doing on this topic, but I won't read it, of course. Just briefly, perhaps the last conference we helped to organize was in Hamburg 1 month ago, a conference by the Völkerkunde Museum in Hamburg on colonial heritage and cultural cooperation. Focusing on the social, on the legal, on the political foundations, and with Wolfgang Kaleck, which was crucial for us, and the questions of circulation and restitution. And at the end, Achille Mbembe would challenge us with his statement saying, what if African countries don't want artifacts to be restituted if you are not ready to link this question with the question of migration? So here we are at this conference, and so we are. The Goethe-Institut is active. We have we work a lot. We reflect upon it. So just let me read a few lines. Our Secretary General just published 2 days ago in the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung. It is crucial that Germany does not oppose a cultural soft power, as others understand it, with a dominant self-representation or even propaganda. Rather, what is needed is cultural work that does not rely on unilateral messages, but on forms that correspond to liberal values, on openness, criticism, and self-criticism, the ability to discourse, and liberal thinking. Especially against the background of German history, only such a cultural policy is credible that does not regard one's own as superior and knows a certain humility in the encounter with the other. So, because we think a lot about it and we are active, we know that we are just at the beginning. And so Johannes Odenthal already said it. Among us are about 25 of my colleagues from all over the world. And I ask all of you, talk to us, make the Goethe-Institut a better place, a place where planetary utopias are discussed and where some of the planetary utopias are being realized. Thank you.
Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to welcome you all to this third symposium of the series, Colonial Repercussions. And I'd like to express my gratitude to Johannes Odenthal and Judith Weber for the opportunity to curate this event. You both have been wonderfully supportive at every stage of planning and implementing this event. We're extremely grateful to all speakers and moderators who accepted our invitation to come to Berlin and share their work with us. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank innumerable other persons at the ADK who took care of important details, from public relations to technical support, from designers of the promotional material to those who organize the logistics. This invisibilized labor has made possible the important collective work of thinking and sharing what we hope to pursue in the next couple of days. So please join me in thanking all these unnamed persons for making this symposium possible. Three quick organizational announcements. Tomorrow's session will not be held here, but at the other venue of the ADK, namely at the Hanseatenweg 10. Please note that we only have seating for 700 people, so it'll be on first-come, first-served basis. The event will be live-streamed. Tickets to this event will be issued from 10:30 onwards at the venue, namely the Hanseatenweg. One last announcement. Two of our speakers, unfortunately, could not make it. Kader Ratia, today who's supposed to present in today's afternoon session, his wife is terribly sick. And tomorrow afternoon session, Antonio fell sick himself, so he won't be able to make it. Now, before I introduce to you the opening speakers of our event, let me briefly share with you some thoughts that inspired this event. As a philosopher, I'm fascinated with words. And what struck me by the fact was that the term for past and future in many non-European languages, like Aymara, Mandarin, Urdu, Hindi, is the same. The Aymara language associates ahead and past and behind and future. Similarly, the Chinese term for the day after tomorrow literally means day behind, whereas the day before yesterday is referred to as front day. The words yesterday and tomorrow both translate to the same word in Hindi and Urdu, namely kal. In Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie remarks, and I quote him, "No people whose word for yesterday is the same as their word for tomorrow can be said to have a firm grip on the time." End of quote. What Rushdie is alluding to is the tenuous relationship between temporality and hope, desire, and imagination for non-dominant futures, the impossible possibility of utopian thinking. For centuries, European colonizers have trawled the globe in search of adventures, chasing the allure of pristine, untouched land and people. Colonies served as fantastic projection screens onto which Europe mapped its forbidden desires and fears, even as they functioned as laboratories of European hopes and imaginations. Coined in 1516, Thomas More's Utopia is both a conceptual novelty as well as one of the earliest examples of imperialist world-making and imagined geography. The novel describes a fictional island society in the South Atlantic Ocean off the coast of South America. Previously, when Christopher Columbus first encountered the New World and its indigenous inhabitants, he believed he had found the Garden of Eden. But as is known, the term utopia is a compound of the syllable oi, no, and topos, place. But the homophonic prefix oi, good, also resonates in the word with the implication that the perfectly good place is really no place, so that the imagined ideal place does not exist yet. Félix González Torres's artwork, Nowhere Better Than This Place, Somewhere Better Than This Place, brilliantly captures this double bind. Given the link between colonialism and utopian experiments, it seems paradoxical to speak of post-colonial utopias. Post-colonial theorists have repeatedly warned that given that Europe universalized its values, norms, epistemologies through colonialism, decolonization is inextricably linked to de-universalizing Europe, even as this aspiration is both impossible but necessary. For the gift and curse of the legacies of European Enlightenment are inseparable from the processes of decolonization. Although Europeans have proven to be the worst betrayers and abusers of the Enlightenment and its ideas of equality, liberty, justice, rights, and democracy, the lofty post-colonial ambitions to save the legacies of the Enlightenment from the Europeans is turning out to be a missed appointment with history. In his 9th thesis of the 1940 essay, Theses on Philosophy of History, Walter Benjamin, who purchased Paul Klee's print of Angelus Novus, speaks of the angel of history who stares back in horror at the ruins of the past. Much as the angel would like to undo the destruction, there is a storm blowing from paradise, which is caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them and is irresistibly propels the angel into the future to which his back is turned. This aptly describes the project of decolonization, which has shifted from a resistant form of anti-colonialism defined as the overcoming of colonial subservience to a tragic mode plagued by failures and resignations. The violent past of colonialism initially gave way to hope for change and the euphoria of post-independence. However, the momentum that once animated anti-colonial aspirations must face up to the brutality of post-colonial realities. Romantic idioms of revolution have fallen short of expectations and are no longer compelling to guarantee an emancipated future. With the endemic problems of economic, social, and political inequality, echoing early slogans of anti-colonialism seem out of place in the face of deep malaise and looming crises. In order to reimagine post-colonial futures, we need to move beyond the belief that in order to decolonize, undoing European colonialism would be sufficient to usher in a world without injustice and oppression. Retrospective politics must be replaced by a new politics of anticipation. This confronts us with the problem of post-colonial oppositional critique. Whom and what should it be directed against? What should be the grammar of this critique? How do we overcome the acute paralysis of will and sheer lack of vision? Does the world in which we live in make post-colonial utopias implausible to imagine? And given these implausible conditions, how do we script our hopes, desires, and imaginaries to overcome the disillusion present? In my view, Frantz Fanon diagnoses one of the most pernicious effects of colonialism, namely its ability to damage the colonized subject's capacity to project itself forward in time. By crippling the sense of temporality of the colonized world, the possibility of imagining radical change after decolonization is incapacitated. Future projects are conquered and bankrupted by forces of capitalism and neocolonialism. The post-colonial world is caught in a cycle of postponed hopes and desires where difference is not allowed to make a difference. To imagine possible tomorrows, politics of despair must be replaced by a new politics of hope, desire, and imagination in the face of uncertain futures. In light of these challenges, the aim of the symposium is to address the unfulfilled aspirations that haunt the post-colonial world, that necessitate ongoing renegotiation and readjustment to a critical attitude. The concept of hauntology, as proposed by Jacques Derrida, describes the sense of melancholia for a future that never arrives. This failure of the future is not defeatism or cynicism, but yearning for that which is perpetually deferred in the ceaseless mode of to come. In the next 2 days, we will have the pleasure of discussing with distinguished speakers their hopes, desires, and imagination for new ways of world-making, a politics of the impossible in the face of the necessary. On this note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the opening plenary. Sara Ahmed is a feminist writer, independent scholar who works at the intersection of feminist, queer, and race studies. Her research is concerned with how bodies and worlds take shape and how power is secured and challenged in everyday life worlds as well as institutional cultures. Until the end of 2016, Sara was professor of race and cultural studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, having been previously based in women's studies at Lancaster University. She resigned from her position at Goldsmiths in protest at the failure to deal with the problem of sexual harassment. She hopes to keep participating in the project of making the problem of sexual harassment at universities more visible, for example, by working with the 1752 group. In her book on being included, on racism and diversity in institutional life, she argues that we need to work on the university when we work at the university. She continues to write, research, and teach while exploring the question on how to live a post-institutional feminist life. In an inspiring post called Resignation is a Feminist Issue on her blog, Feminist Killjoys, what a wonderful word, Sara Ahmed explains, and I quote her, that the figure of the feminist killjoy speaks to how feminists are judged as causing unhappiness. You are often presumed to be complaining because you are unhappy. When you point out sexism or racism, you get in the way of happiness. When you point out we learn about happiness from those who get in the way. Sara Ahmed advises we must stay unhappy with this world, and adds, when joy becomes aspiration, then joy becomes what a killjoy has to kill. End of quote. In her recent work, Living a Feminist Life, Sara focuses on the political labor of complaint, resignifying terms like resignation and complaint to take away their negative and paralyzing connotations. Sara proposes resignation and complaint as empowering and energizing instead of upsetting, exhausting, and saddening. It is an effort of turning personal crises and traumas into political resistance and renewal. Drawing on Audre Lorde's A Litany of Survival, Ahmed remarks that feminism is a killjoy's survival kit, and survival is a warfare and can be about keeping one's hope alive. To live a feminist life entails embracing the roles of agitator, misfit, pest, and killjoy, basically as troublemakers, who also persistently get into trouble. But as Ahmed reminds, feminism is what we need to handle the consequences of being feminist. We witness as feminists the trouble feminism causes. Survival, Sara explains, is a radical action, a refusal not to exist until you do not exist, like Black Lives Matter. Inversely, those who do not have to struggle for their own survival dismiss those who have to attend to their own survival as self-indulgent. For Ahmed, anti-racist queer feminist work is about communities assembled out of experiences of being shattered. But she also suggests that sometimes a feminist has to go on strike. To strike is to put down your tools, to refuse to work by working with them. And lastly, she tells us that being a killjoy is being affirmative, because in struggling for life, we believe in life all the more. Like Lord, a feminist killjoy for Ahmed is an erotic figure. An erotic figure who comes to be in negation, but that negation trembles with desire. A desire for more to life, more desire, a desire for more. She advises that we choose our battles carefully and do not forget to laugh at the absurdity of the world, to stir things up and live in the stew. Ahmed tells us, in my Killjoy survival kit, I'd like to have a bag of fresh chilies. I tend to add chilies to most things. I agree with Sara. Chilies make everything better. Dear Sara, it's a great, great pleasure to have you here with us, and I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you, Nikita. I'm just so delighted to be here. I appreciate very much that you're here with me in this room. A killjoy always lives in good company is one of my claims. So I think I need the PowerPoint slide on, if someone can do that for me. Thank you. Do I need to do something else? Ah, here we are. On March the 10th, On March the 10th, 2014, a panel, Why Isn't My Professor Black?, took place at University College London with Black British scholars William Acker, Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman, Deborah Gabrielle, Lisa Amanda Palmer, Nathan Richards, and Shirley Tate. Why isn't my professor Black? What a necessary and urgent question. At the end of the panel, a member of the audience asked another necessary and urgent question about the UCL's continued use of Francis Galton's name. Galton, as I'm sure many of you know, coined the word eugenics, described by him as a science of improvement. Galton bequeathed funds to UCL, then London University, for a professorship as well as a department of eugenics. The UCL has removed the word eugenics, they replaced it with genetics, but they have kept Galton's name. The provost of the UCL at the panel justified the continued use of Galton's name by saying, "In my defense, I inherited him." A use can be explained and defended as inheritance. There has since been a wider and meaningful discussion of the role of Galton's legacy at UCL, but this questioning of a legacy was represented to the wider public as the Galton Must Fall campaign. Whilst we might support such a campaign if it did indeed exist, there was no such campaign. It was, in fact, invented by the media to discredit the questioning of a legacy as both censorship and what they call cultural vandalism. When it was pointed out that such a campaign did not exist, the newspaper went ahead and made some small amendments, happily clarifying that such a campaign has, quote, yet to materialise. What is clarifying is how discrediting works. To discredit the questioning of a legacy is to discredit the questioner. Even posing a question, even making history questionable is framed as vandalism, a willful destruction of the venerable and beautiful. A judgment can be turned into a project. If questioning what is received as inheritance is understood as damaging institutions, we might indeed need to damage institutions. So much of the work we do is dealing with the consequences of the work we do. So in my lecture today, I want to talk about no as work, as the work you have to do in order not to reproduce an inheritance. We might think of this no as expressive. The word express comes from press. It implies something that is squeezed out. To get a no out, you have to do more than say no. A no needs somewhere to go. So my talk today will be concerned with what we could call diversity work, the ordinary and often painstaking work of working on institutions so that they become more accommodating. And I'll be talking specifically about working on universities. Although I'm no longer on it, although I'm no longer at it, I'm still on it. Got to get that right. I'm still on it. So it might seem like an odd choice for an event on utopianism, desire, and hope to be talking about doing this kind of institutional work, the kind that often does not seem to get us very far. But for me, it is from the very small efforts to make room that we register the full force of just what we are up against. So maybe what I'll be offering today is what we might call a killjoy utopianism, a willingness to inhabit what seems negative as an insistence that worlds can be otherwise. We are willing to be there in the wear and the tear for as long as it takes. I'll be drawing on arguments from a book I've recently completed, What's the Use? On the Uses of Use. In this book, I follow use around the way I followed happiness in The Promise of Happiness and the will in Willful Subjects. And I've followed use right back into the university as a way of thinking about how universities are built. We might recall how the use of Galton's name is justified as inheritance, use as keeping a history alive. I'll also be drawing on data I collected for my project on diversity, which I first presented in my book, On Being Included, as well as some new material from a project on complaint, in which I'm talking to students, academics, and administrators about their experience of making complaints within universities. So this first section is called Uses of Use. To transform institutions requires becoming conscious of just how they are built. So we can think of this consciousness as consciousness of use. So I start with use. To start with use is to start small. Use is a small word with a lot of work to do. Rita Felsky has described use as workmanlike. Use, when used as a verb, can mean to employ for some purpose, to expend or consume, to treat or behave toward, to take unfair advantage of or exploit, to habituate or accustom. Use is a relation as well as an activity that often points beyond something. Even when use is about something, to use something points to what something is for. Some objects are made in order to be used. What they are for brings them into existence. But even if something is shaped around what it is for, that is not the end of the story. As Howard Rosati notes in A Theory of Craft, use need not correspond to intended function. Most, if not all, objects can have a use, or more accurately, be made usable by being put to use. A sledgehammer can pound, or it can be used as paperweight or lever. A handsaw can cut a board and be used as straight edge or to make music. A chair can be sat in and used to prop open a door. These uses make them useful objects, but since they are unrelated to the intended purpose and function for which these objects are made, knowing these uses doesn't necessarily reveal much about these objects. So use can correspond to intended function, but use does not necessarily correspond to intended function, and this not necessarily is an opening. I'm not so sure if uses are quite as unrevealing about things as Rosati implies, at least here. I'm being told something about the qualities of a sledgehammer, that it can be used to be a paperweight. That a sledgehammer can be used as a paperweight is telling me something about the heaviness of the sledgehammer and indeed about the lightness of paper. Something cannot be used for anything. Use then is a restriction of possibility that is material. Nevertheless, there is something queer about use because intentions do not exhaust possibilities. So Rosati implies that use makes something usable. Use can also make something used. Wear and tear usually means a depreciation of value. I think of the surface of a table, worn, scratched. Marx suggests that when a table is exchanged, it ceases to be a mundane object, that ordinary sensuous thing. To use a table is to bring it back down to earth. We can think then of the marks left by use, not as the erosion of value, but as testimony, the table as testifying to a history. Marx does, in fact, in Capital, discuss wear and tear in relation to machines. The material wear and tear of a machine is of two kinds. The one arises from use, as coins wear away by circulating, the other from non-use, as a sword rusts when left in its scabbard. He showed that machinery intensifies rather than saves labour. You have to get the most out of the machine before it wears out. A wearing that is passed on to workers, wearing out as passing on and passing out, used as used up. A worn thing might eventually break. When something breaks from use, it might be taken out of use, rather like this cup which has lost its handle, a rather sad parting. When we think of something as being in use, we might think of a sign on a door, occupied. The sign tells us, we're familiar, the toilet is in use. It tells us, this is a use instruction, that you have to wait until whoever is using the toilet has finished. Use often comes with instructions that are about maintaining personal and social boundaries. Or take this image of a postbox. There is a sign that politely asks a would-be poster not to use the postbox by posting a letter into the box. So in the previous image, the toilet was occupied because it was in use. In this case, the postbox is out of use because it's occupied. Although, of course, from another point of view, the birds, it is in use. The postbox has become a home for nesting birds. So intended functionality can mean who something is for, not just what something is for. And this means that something can be used by those for whom it was not intended. A change of function does still, however, require a sign, please do not use, to stop what would be usual, which is a person posting a letter through the box. That sign, we assume, is temporary. The box will come back into use as a postbox when it ceases to be a nest. Back into use. Use can involve comings and goings. Take the example of the well-trodden path. The path exists in part because people have used it. Use involves contact and friction, the tread of feet smoothing the surface. The path is becoming smoother, easier to follow. The more a path is used, the more a path is used. How strange that this sentence makes sense. Without use, that path might disappear, becoming overgrown, bumpy, unusable. Like this path, we know it's a path from the sign, but you can hardly see the sign for the leaves. A path can appear as a line on a landscape, but a path can also be a route through life. Heterosexuality is often understood as a path, and thus then also as an easing of a passage, a clearing of a way forward. To deviate from that path can be hard. When it is harder to proceed, when a path is harder to follow, you might be discouraged. You might try and find another route. Think of how you can be dissuaded by perpetual reminders of just how hard something would be. Deviation is hard. Deviation is made hard. So much is reproduced by the requirement to follow. In the Academy, you might be asked to follow the well-trodden paths of citation. To cite properly, to have good manners, is to cite those deemed to have already had the most influence. The more a path is used, the more a path is used. The more he is cited, the more he is cited. A path is kept clear through work. Occupation then depends upon erasure. such and such white man might become an originator of a concept, an idea as becoming seminal, by removing traces of those who were here before. When use leaves traces in places, occupation involves the removal of those traces. On being stopped. Diversity work is the work of trying to transform institutions by opening them up to populations that had hitherto been excluded. As such, diversity work seems to involve deviating from the well-used paths, not going the way things are flowing. And yet, at another level, diversity seems to be a rather well-used path, an arrow even, which can be an instruction and thus a direction. Go that way. The ease with which diversity travels might be why diversity work is such hard work. One diversity practitioner described diversity as a big shiny apple. It all looks wonderful, but the inequalities aren't being addressed. The word diversity might be used more because it does less. It can be a sign of the difficulty of getting through. This practitioner described her own work thus: it's a banging your head against a brick wall job. So here, a job description becomes a wall description. If you keep banging your head against that wall, but the wall keeps its place, it is you that gets sore. And what happens to the wall? All you seem to have done is scratch the surface. And this is what diversity work often feels like, scratching the surface, scratching at the surface. And even if you just scratch the surface, you can still be liable for damages. So let me share with you an example from my research of an encounter with an institutional wall. It's from a practitioner who had developed a new policy on how academic appointments are made. And like all wall stories, this is long, and I have to read it in full to give you a sense of what that wall can feel like. When I was first here, there was a policy that you had to have 3 people in every panel who had been diversity trained, but then there was a decision early on when I was here that it should be everybody, all panel members, at least internal people. They took that decision at the Equality and Diversity Committee, which several members of the senior management team were present at. But then the Director of Human Resources found out about it and decided we didn't have the resources to support it, and it went to Council with that taken out. And Council were told that they were happy to have just 3 members only. A person on Council who was an external member of the Diversity Committee went ballistic, and I'm not kidding, went ballistic, and said the minutes didn't reflect what had happened in the meeting because the minutes said the decision was different to what actually happened, and I didn't take the minutes, by the way. And so they had to take it through and reverse it. And the council decision was that all people should be trained. And despite that, I have then sat in meetings where they have just continued saying that it has to just be 3 people on the panel. And I said, but no, council changed their view, and I can give you the minutes. And they just look at me as if I'm saying something really stupid. This went on for ages, even though the council minutes definitely said all panel members should be trained. And to be honest, sometimes you just give up. So it seems as if a decision has been made, but that decision can be overridden by the momentum of the past. The past becomes that well-worn path. What usually happens still happens. And note then that the head of human resources did not need to take the policy out of the minutes for the policy not to come into effect. I've called this dynamic non-performativity, when naming something does not bring something into effect, or even more strongly, when something is named in order not to bring something into effect. So the wall is that which keeps standing. I think of the wall as a finding, so let me summarize the finding. What stops movement moves. So if we witness their movement, we might miss the stopping mechanism. And I think this is very important, as organisations are very good at moving things around. Creating evidence of doing something is not the same thing as doing something. In our example, what stopped something from happening could have been the removal of the policy from the minutes. It could have been the failure of anyone at council to notice its removal, but it wasn't. It was the way they acted within the institution after the policy had been agreed. So we also learn agreeing to something can be another way of stopping something from happening. And this means too that a diversity policy can come into existence without coming into use. I noted earlier how a sign is used to make a transition from something being in and out of use, such as in the case of the postbox. Institutions are also postal systems. So maybe the diversity worker deposits the policy into the box because she assumes it's in use. She's received that assumption, she's following the procedure. The postbox that is not in use without a sign indicating so might have another function to stop the policy from going through the system. So the policy becomes dusty to evoke Marx's rusty sword, from rusty to dusty. A policy can become unusable by not being used. Consider also the energy that this practitioner expended on developing a policy that does not do anything. The story of how the wall keeps standing is the same story as the story of how a diversity worker becomes shattered. As she says, sometimes you just give up. Maybe you end up feeling used up, limp, rather like this tube of toothpaste, as if you've got nothing left to give. Or maybe you fly off the handle to recall that broken cup, an expression that can also mean to snap or to lose your temper. You become the one who can't handle things. You don't have to say anything to be heard as breaking something. Another practitioner described to me, you know, you go through that in these sort of jobs where you got to say something and you can just see people going, oh, here she goes. We both laughed, recognising that each other recognised that scene. The feminist killjoy, that leaky container, she comes up here. She comes up in what we can hear. We can hear each other in the wear and the tear of the words we share. We can hear what it's like to come up against the same thing over and over again. We imagine the eyes rolling as if to say, well, she would say that. It was from experiences like this that I developed my equation, rolling eyes equals feminist pedagogy. A wall can be what you encounter because of what you are trying to do. Making a complaint can also involve coming up against walls. If a policy appears to create a path, that path can be how you're stopped from getting through. Complaints procedures are often pictured as paths. Paths as flowcharts. Flow, flow, away we go, with arrows that give the would-be complainant a route through. I spoke to one practitioner about her work in supporting students through the complaint process. So your first stage would require the complainant to try and resolve it informally, which is really difficult in some situations, and which is where it might get stuck in a department. And so it takes a really tenacious, complaining student to say, no, I am being blocked. And so you can imagine that something on paper that looks very linear is actually very circular a lot of the time. And I think that's the problem. Students get discouraged and get demoralised and they feel hard done by and nothing's getting resolved and they are in a murky place and they can't get out. A complaint, then, is not simply an outcome of a no. A complaint requires you to keep saying no along the way. And what then is required to keep that complaint going, in this practitioner's terms, confidence and tenacity, might be what is negated by the very experiences that led you to make a complaint in the first place. Complaints can also be stopped by the use of warnings. A warning can function rather like a singular exclamation point. We know what they are telling us to do from how they are used. Stop, danger ahead. One student describes, I was repeatedly told that rocking the boat or making waves would affect my career in the future and I would ruin the department for everyone else. I was told if I did put in a complaint, I would never be able to work in the university and that it was likely I wouldn't get a job elsewhere. Complaining is framed as self-damage, as well as damage to others, ruining a department no less. And this student describes how the pressure not to complain was exerted. In just one day, I was subjected to 8 hours of grueling meetings and questioning, almost designed to break me and stop me from taking the complaint any further. You don't have to prevent people from doing something. You can just make it harder for them to do something. Remember, deviation is hard. Deviation is made hard. Complaints can also be stopped by the appearance of being heard. An academic describes what followed when students made a complaint about the behaviour of professors at research events. A meeting is set up by said professors. They said they would have an open meeting, but it was just about calming the students down. The example of a diversity policy that did not come into use also implied that an organisation can say yes to a new policy when there's not enough behind that yes to bring something about. So perhaps an organisation can allow a no to be expressed when that no has nowhere to go. Venting is then used as a technique for preventing something more explosive from happening. You let a complaint be expressed in order that it can be contained. So then once the students have vented their frustrations, getting the complaint out of their system, the complaint is out of the system. I think of this mechanism as rather like a pressure relief valve that releases just enough pressure so that it does not build up and cause an explosion. So if you do keep going with a complaint, where do they end up? Thus far, I've received numerous accounts of complaints that are lodged and still nothing happens. Perhaps complaints sit there rather like that diversity policy, the postbox becoming a filing cabinet. A complaint is filed away. And files can also function as bins, how things are discarded. One student describes it gets shoved in the box. Another, I feel like my complaint has gone into the complaint graveyard. A filing cabinet as a graveyard, maybe there's a ghostly promise in that. When a complaint is filed away or binned, those who complain can end up that they too have been filed away or binned. This section is called Closing the Door. Sometimes a complaint is registered because of who you are not. And a not can be about what you have to do and where you have to go. You might end up on a diversity committee because of who you are not. Not man, not white, not cis, not straight, not able-bodied. The more nots you are, the more committees you end up on. Even if you agree to be on the diversity committee, they can still find you disagreeable. A woman of colour academic describes. I was on the equality and diversity group in the university, and as soon as I started mentioning things to do with race, they changed the portfolio of who could be on the committee, and I was dropped. I noted earlier that diversity might be used more because it does less. Well, the word race might be used less because it does more. The word race carries a complaint. Race as a refusal of the smile of diversity. Any use of the word race becomes an overuse. She added to me in her description, whenever you raise something, the response is, you are not one of them. Not one of them. A complaint seems to amplify what makes you not fit, picking up on what you are not. Perhaps a not is heard as shouting, as insistence, a stress point, a sore point, a complaint, when a not becomes an exclamation point. So a complaint can be how you are received. A complaint can also be what you have to make because of how the university is occupied. So she also talked to me about how she set up a writing group in her department and how the meetings became dominated very quickly by senior men. What I found in each of the meetings were senior men who were bullying everyone in the room. This bullying took the form of the constant belittling of the work of more junior academics as well as postgraduate students. The first session, someone was being just really abusive about someone's PhD, saying it was rubbish. Racist comments are made. I'm from London, and London is just ripe for ethnic cleansing. She described how people laughed and how that laughter filled the room. She comments on these comments. These were the sorts of things being aired. These were the sorts of things, sentences as sentencing, violence thrown out as how some are thrown out. Even the air can be occupied. So, she decided to make a complaint because she wanted it recorded and because the culture was being reproduced for new PhD students. So a complaint becomes a recording device. You have to record what you do not want to reproduce. So she gathered statements from around 20 people in her department. So a complaint can be a feminist collective. A complaint can be evidence of a no that is shared. A meeting is set up in response to her complaint. At that meeting, she was described by the head of human resources as having a chip on her shoulder. If you chip away at the old block, they find that chip quite quickly on your shoulder, as if she complains because she has a personal grudge. She added, they treated submission as an act of arrogance on my part. So it's as if she put a complaint forward as a way of putting herself forward, a complaint treated as self-promotional. And her complaint goes nowhere. When those who try to stop a culture from being reproduced are stopped, a culture is being reproduced. And she described the department as a revolving door. Women and minorities arrive only to head right back out again. Whoosh, whoosh, You might have to get out because of what you find out when you get in. Doors, they keep coming up. Doors are not just physical things that swing on hinges, though they are that. They are mechanisms that enable an opening or closing. Diversity is often represented as an open door. Minorities welcome. Come in, come in. Diversity as a tagline, tag along, tagged on. Come in, come in. I think back to our postbox. There could have been another sign on the box, birds welcome. That sign, birds welcome, would be a non-performative if the postbox was still in use, because the birds would be dislodged by the letters, the nest destroyed before it could be created. I suggested earlier that use is a restriction of possibility that is material. We are now learning how use can be how restrictions become material. The letters in the postbox, the words that are thrown out, they become materials, they pile up. They stop others from making use of something. What is material to some, leaving you with no room to breathe, to nest, to be, can be what does not matter to others because it does not get in the way of their occupation of space. It might even enable that occupation. You can stop others from using a space by how a space is being used, by what a space is being used for. That for can become a door. A door can be what stops you from getting in. A door can be what stops you from getting out. I'm speaking to an academic about the first complaint she made when she was a postgraduate student. One of the lecturers on her course had been making her feel uncomfortable. One time, she enters his room. And then one afternoon, I went into his office to talk to him about something. It was an office a bit like this, but without any glass, with a door that opened inwards and opened on a latch. And he pushed me up against the back of the door, and I tried to kiss me, and I pushed him away. It was an instinctive pushed him away, and tried to get out of the room, and it was a horrible moment, because I realised I couldn't actually. It was very difficult to operate the latch. A door without glass, solid, can't be seen through. A door is what you're pushed against. A latch that won't open, getting stuck, trying to get out, the work you have to do to get out. She did get out of his room, but it was hard. Behind closed door, harassment happens there, out of view, in secret. A door is shut on her. The same door is shut on her complaint. She submits an informal letter, a letter which details the assault. So where does her complaint go? It ends up with the dean. And what does the dean do? The dean basically told me I should sit down and have a cup of tea with this guy to sort it out. The response to a complaint about harassment is to minimise that harassment as if what occurred is just a minor squabble between two parties, something that can be sorted out by a cup of tea, that English signifier of reconciliation. To formalise a complaint would then become a failure, her failure, to resolve the situation more amicably. Would have become. She did not proceed to a formal complaint. Her complaint was stopped, he was not. I say her complaint was stopped rather than she was stopped because she did go on to have a career. I spoke to her when she was now she's a professor. But her experience stayed with her. She described, I thought I got a first because of academic merit, but then after this happened, I remember thinking, but hang on, maybe not. Maybe this was some sort of ruse to try and keep me in the institution so we could keep the contact going. It starts undermining your own sense of your academic merit, the quality of your work, and all that kind of stuff. Being harassed by a lecturer damages your sense of self-worth, intellectual worth, leading you to question yourself, doubt yourself. Her complaint was stopped. She was not, but she carries that history with her. What happened to him? He was a known harasser. There were lots of stories about him. I had a friend who was very vulnerable. He took advantage of that. She ended up taking her own life. So much more pain, so much more damage at the edges of this one woman's story of damage. He went on. He was allowed to go on when her complaint, and for all we know, there were others too. We do not know how many said no, did not stop him. And he has since retired, much respected by his peers, no blemish on his record. The damage carried by those who did complain or would complain if they could complain is carried around like baggage, slow, heavy down. To hear complaint is to hear from those weighed down by a history that has not left any trace in the official records. No blemish on his record, no trace in the official records. The organisation shares an interest in stopping what is recorded by a complaint from getting out. A complaint can be stopped because of what is shared. When an MA student made an informal complaint about the conduct of the most senior member of her department, she was told by the convener of the MA program, Be careful, he is an important man. Be careful. A warning not to proceed is a statement about who is important. And importance is not just a judgment, it's a direction. The more a path is used, the more a path is used. The more he is connected, the more he is connected. The more he is connected, the more others become invested in that connection. A professor becomes then a conductor. Information, energy, resources are travelling through him. I think of this becoming as institutional funneling. Paths become narrower and narrower at the exit points. You have to go through him to get anywhere. Uses of use, a restriction of possibility that has become material. Uses of use, a narrowing of the routes. The more a path is used, the less path there are to use. More going through less. More going through less. This student, she went ahead with a complaint. In her terms, she sacrificed the references. In reference to the prospect of doing a PhD, she said, that door is closed. That door is closed. References too can function as doors, mechanisms that enable an opening or closing, how it is made possible for some to progress, others not. Reference systems are how some are enabled by their connections, how some gather speed and velocity more and more, faster and faster. He is an important man. Many do not make complaints because they feel like they can't afford to lose the references, not complaining as a way of keeping a door open. And so much of our political work is the work we have to do to ensure that making a complaint does not mean closing a door. This is my conclusion. I'm actually talking about a leak is a lead. So you have to work to keep going, to keep a complaint going. We are willing to be there in the wear and the tear for as long as it takes. In giving my ear to complaint, I'm learning and listening with hope and to hope. By this, I do not mean I feel hopeful, or those that I have spoken to feel hopeful, though we might do and we can do. But to persist with a complaint is hopeful because despite the negation, you're having to insist and keep insisting that there is a point to persisting. To persist with a complaint requires a refusal of what I think of as institutional fatalism, that sense that this is just how things are, that abuses of power, even when fatal, are inevitable, same old bodies doing the same old things. You persist because you sense what is possible, that spaces can be freed up when they are inhabited differently. Perhaps this image can be a pointer, teaching us what is possible, because the birds could have been treated as trespassers, ejected or displaced. A history of use is also a history of such displacements, many violent, displacements that often disappear because of how things remain occupied. To make room for others so often requires work, hard work, painstaking work, and certainly collective work. To fight for room is to fight for a possibility that has been restricted by use. A complaint, when you have to fight for a possibility. My project on complaint was inspired by my own experiences of working on multiple inquiries into sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, which is to say, my project was inspired by students, and this work is for you. After 3 years, I eventually resigned. I know it's taken me a long time to talk about resignation, but not as long as it took me to resign. And it's still difficult for me to talk about my resignation in public, so please bear with me. The details will be absent, but I, at least, am present. I resigned because I had enough and because I did not want to stay silent about what had been going on. Resignation can be another way of saying no to the system. You withdraw your body, your labour, yourself. The word resignation can seem to suggest giving up, reconciling yourself to your fate, to resign yourself to something. I hear the word resignation and I hear a long, drawn-out sigh. But resignation can also be how you refuse to resign yourself to a situation. Perhaps you are giving up on something, a belief that you can do the work here, but you're also holding on to something, a belief in that work. So what appears to be giving up can be a refusal to give in. I resigned in part because of the silence about what had been going on. So sometimes to get information out, you need yourself to get out. And there is no point in being silent about resigning if you are resigning to protest silence. When I shared the reasons for my resignation, I became very quickly the cause of damage. I became a leaky pipe, drip, drip. Just loosen the screw a little bit, a tiny, tiny little bit, and more comes out. It can be explosive what comes out. We need more explosions. Organisations will try and contain the damage. The response, in other words, is damage limitation, and this is how diversity often takes institutional form. Damage limitation. Happy, shiny policies will be put in place, holes left by departures filled without reference to what went on before, a block becoming something to be wiped up and wiped away, mopping up a mess. But there is hope here, because they can't mop up all of that mess. A leak can be a lead. A leak can be a feminist lead. So it might seem that complaints that do not get anywhere disappear without a trace, like their unused path, hard to find and harder to follow. But in saying no, we keep a history alive, we do not let go. Even complaints that do not seem to get anywhere can lead us to each other. So feminist memory can become a counter-institutional project. We have to find ways of creating paths for others to follow, to leave traces in places. We refuse to let a refusal disappear. An Indigenous student made a complaint about white supremacy in her classroom. Using that kind of term for what is here at the university can get you in serious trouble. She knew that, but she was willing to do that. And she became, in her terms, an Indigenous feminist monster and is now completing her PhD off campus. She said that an unexpected little gift was how other students would come to her. They know you are out there and they can reach out to you. She used that expression a number of times, an unexpected little gift. You can hold on by passing a refusal on. Even what or who has been binned can acquire a new life. The complaints in the graveyard can come back to haunt institutions. It is a promise, maybe also a threat. When you are stopped, you have to find other methods of getting information out. It is not just that we have exhausted the usual procedures or that we are exhausted by them, though many of us have and are. We have also learnt that working in-house too often ends up being a restoration project, polishing the furniture so it appears less damaged, a labour I've called, with reference to the uses of diversity, institutional polishing. In-house, the master's house, we can remember Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Of course, we do have limited options and we use the tools that are available to us. Sometimes we even do what is required. We might even be willing to be diversity, to smile, to help with the creation of a shinier reflection. But we have to be careful not to lose ourselves in that reflection. We do not want to polish away the scratches. They are testimony. Yes, those scratches, we are back to those scratches. We can reach each other through what appears as damage, mere scratch and scribble. Feminism becomes writing on the wall. We were here. We did not get used to it. Thank you.
I think there's no better way to start a symposium on utopias. That's how powerful Sara is. There's no better way to start a symposium on utopias rather than, let me restart the sentence. The best way to start a symposium on utopias is to talk about resignation. Thank you, Sara. That was so inspiring. I'm now going to introduce the second speaker, and then we'll have the Q&A in the end, the discussion in the end. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce the second speaker, David Scott, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University and director of the Small Axe Project and editor of its print journal, Small Axe. He's the author of Formations of Ritual, Colonial and Anthropological Discourses on the Sinhala Yaktoville, Refashioning Futures, Criticism After Post-Coloniality, Conscripts of Modernity, The Tragedy of Colonial Modernity, Omens of Adversity, Tragedy, Time, Memory, Justice, and most recently, Stuart Hall's Voice, Intimations of an Ethics of Receptive Generosity, and is the co-editor of Powers of the Secular Modern, Talal Asad and his interlocutors. In his book, Conscripts of Modernity, The Tragedy of Colonial Enlightenment, David Scott traces the shift from a resistant form of anti-colonialism defined as the overcoming of colonial subservience to a tragic mode plagued by paradoxes and reversals. As Scott explains, anti-colonial revolutions held the promise of overcoming colonialism as a totalized structure of brutality, violence, objectification, racism, and exclusion. The wounded past was to be replaced by the healing present. The destructive power of colonialism was confronted with a regenerative counterpower of anti-colonialism. Colonialism's totalizing dehumanization shapes the indignant vocabulary of anti-colonial revolutions. However, Scott asks provocatively, and I quote him, "What if the persuasive force of the past no longer serves to guarantee the opening of an emancipated future? What if romantic notions of resistance and overcoming are no longer compelling?" And to continue to quote Scott, "Anti-colonial utopias have gradually withered into post-colonial nightmares." End of quote. If the price of decolonization was a certain disenchantment with the European Enlightenment, what is the cost of reenchantment? In order to reimagine post-colonial futures, Scott urges a rethinking of our relationship to the racist and colonialist past and a move away from the narratives of vindication. Scott's lamentation, "We live in tragic times," marks the crisis of the project of decolonization. What is at stake is critically thinking through the post-colonial present is not the fixing of a teleological plot to realize predefined goals, but the refusal to be seduced by the disillusioned present. Our histories of the past should be strategic interrogations of the present as a way of helping us to envision the possibilities for an alternative future. Scott draws the crucial link between tragedy and critique, insofar as tragedies are marked by moral conflicts, contingencies, vulnerabilities, and the reversibility of all aspirations and accomplishments. Leading us away from a progressive dialectical resolution, tragedies do not offer consolations. In Scott's view, the post-colonial condition marked by unfulfilled promises is neither the extension of the Enlightenment project nor its rejection. Rather, the Enlightenment is the permanent legacy that sets the conditions of future post-colonial possibility and which therefore demands constant renegotiation and readjustment. Dear David, it's a great, great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that undeserved introduction, Nikita. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, Judith, for getting me here this morning after a bit of a crisis. And thank you all for being here. I hope you can hear me if I speak roughly at this level. This is my water. Yeah, thanks. The title of my presentation today is going to be Black Futurities, Past and Present, Thinking Reparations Through. And it's a small bit of a larger project in progress, and which is going in many different directions. The first section is called Futurities, Past and Present. Futurity seems to me a very difficult idea to think with in this conjuncture, at least in the old way. The cold artificiality and abstraction of the term itself perhaps signals less our intellectual astuteness or our courage than in fact our desperation and our confusion, certainly our inability to clarify, even to ourselves, our pervasive apprehension of the vanishing horizon of futures more attractive than the present. I've been saying this for a while in varying contexts, that the temporality that shaped, and I believe that profoundly, not superficially shaped, our past sense of the constitutive relation between pasts, presents, and futures has come undone, run aground, or anyway no longer accords with something fundamental in our experience and expectations of the rhythms of contemporary time. Our past sense of futurity as the longing for and expectation of a progressive or even a revolutionary overcoming of the limitations and discontents of the past, overcoming a past thought of as limitation and discontent, has virtually evaporated, such that we no longer have any confidence that the present will give rise to a future significantly different from the past, a future without the present's burdened inheritance of the past's violations and subjugations and dispossessions. In a very curious and disconcerting, but increasingly normalized way, where once the future was an enchanted source of expectation and desire and hope and even planning, such that we lived ever tilted in anticipation of the emancipated possibilities promised in new tomorrows. Now it is the past that animates, or better, that ferments, breeds our temporal preoccupations. Where we were once aspiring emancipationists, now we are all catastrophists. Where the past was a time of suffering or unfreedom to be left behind or redeemed in an imminent future waiting to be born, now the past has installed itself as a permanent dimension of an endlessly enduring present. In a paradoxical way, it is as though, now robbed of a transformative future to look forward to, we are resigned to looking backward to the past and making the best of it. Now, one paradigmatic geopolitical site on which the old sense of emancipationist futurity has been historically enacted is that of the struggles of African-descended people in the New World. For a very long time, and for fully intelligible reasons, we have willfully and poetically constructed our stories of the relation between our slave pasts, our unfree presents, and our possible emancipated futures as a great progressive story of revolutionary redemption. The varied forms of this heroic narrative are as familiar in the African Americas of the continental United States as of the archipelagic Caribbean. In it, we mobilize the picture of the slave past, of the wanton brutalities of the Middle Passage, the cruel indignities of the auction block, the inconsolable loss of family and kin, the irretrievable rupture of cultural memory, and the coercive resocialization, seasoning, as it was called, as racial subjects, the unspeakable violations to body and mind and spirit of plantation life, in order to feed and nourish our will to cultural coherence and political self-determination. In short, to vindicate our transgressed humanity, we cultivated a radical tradition of longing for the promise of social and spiritual salvation from Rastafari to Black Marxism. But we live today across the Black diaspora in the middle of the unraveling of the self-evident purchase of this narrative of Black liberation. Those of us old enough to have lived through some of the pivotal moments of Black and Third World revolutionary possibility in the 20th century, and generations is, I think, a temporal concept indispensable for our disillusioned time, have to work hard to contextualize our nostalgia. In a tangible sense, we live in a pervasively precarious time in which our collective irrelevance and disposability have never been more apparent. There is a widespread sense, now more than ever, that the Black past, the legacy of slavery, remains before us, not behind us, and any future must depend on how the present incorporates the past. The second section is called "A Last Utopia?" One way of characterizing the era in which we live is to say that the great modern age of universal emancipations, of liberations and revolutions, and even of good old-fashioned progressive social democracy, has been replaced by the age of universal human rights. I believe this is simply an ideological fact in the sense that there is no point saying, as many critical minds do, that one does not believe in human rights. Belief is irrelevant. Human rights are the zeitgeist of our age, its moral self-image, parading as a last utopia. It constitutes the new normative background and the new normative horizon in relation to which we are obliged to think about what is wrong with our world and what should be done to change it for the better. There is much, of course, that is deeply doubtful about the discourse and practice of international human rights, about its inseparable entanglement with liberal individualism and neoliberal globalization, with the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, with US imperial power, with Western cultural hegemony, and so on. But there may well be as much about what this age illuminates as about what it occludes that is worth considering, at least on the grounds of that well-known principle that we are where we are, and we have to find our way from here. If we want to think against human rights or beyond it, if that is our politics, we nevertheless have to think through it. One effect and condition of what I'm calling the age of human rights has been a redescription of the past in the present, and therefore a redescription of what needs to be changed in order to create a better future. Crucial, I think, to this redescription is that what hitherto might have been thought of as social and economic subjugations and oppressions, even exploitations, to be overcome or more militantly overthrown, are now reconceived as historical wrongs to be rectified or historical injuries to be repaired. This is the province of reparatory justice. Notably, its model and idiom are juridical and moral psychological, rather than social, economic, political. Its aim is to repair the past, not transform it. The language, I think, is instructive for considerations of futurity and temporality more generally. Reparatory justice emerged in our human rights age as a branch of justice distinct from the two traditional branches. On the one hand, retributive justice concerned with punishment, and on the other, redistributive justice concerned with equity. Its concern is with what to do about past injustices, with what the obligations and responsibilities are of wrongdoers or their heirs, or descendants, or successors, or beneficiaries for those injustices. Reparatory justice implies that past actions are morally connected to present responsibilities. Thus, it takes it that the past is not past, but alive with unresolved transgressions that continue to have effects in the present on the lives of the living. both in terms of obligations to make reparation and entitlements to receive them. The principle, someone like Angelo Corlett might say, is simply that unrighted wrongs remain wrongs still. Moral obligations, at least in respect of grave violations, cannot be constrained by the legal artifice of statutes of limitation. Notice the register, then, of reparatory justice. It is about rights, not freedoms. It is about the past, more so than the future. Unquestionably, reparatory justice represents a conception of change made for a world in which the emancipatory overcoming of the intolerable past in the present is no longer a salient way of thinking the future in the present. Reparatory justice responds to a retemporalization of historical time. It reenchants the past as a time not yet past that lives transgenerationally in the present as an unresolved disfigurement. In a certain sense, of course, from a certain perspective, this may seem a compromise with the liberal capitalist status quo. It forecloses a once valorized picture of time, change, and futurity. My wager, though, as you might by now have suspected, is that it might also paradoxically enable us to think aspects of the past, or the idea of pasts, that this valorized but exhausted picture has obscured, or anyway neglected. The next section is called The Morality of Black Reparations. The reparatory justice with which I am specifically interested here concerns black reparation. They concern the just repair in the present of the New World slave past, and they concern the obligation to repair that past injustice as a condition of any possible futurity. In truth, I am not very sure that New World slavery is irreparable injustice. I suspect not, as I'm arguing elsewhere. It may be that there are injustices, call them evils, so vicious and so callous and so disavowed and of such long standing that they are beyond repair in any conceivable sense of the word. If there are such evils, New World slavery is principal among them. But even if this is so, it cannot exempt those who bear moral responsibility from being called to account, nor can it preclude those victimized by the wrong of slavery from their just entitlement to the debt that is owed to them. The idea of black reparatory justice depends, in part, on a description of New World slavery as a regime of systematic theft, both material and moral. The theft not only of the prospect of material wherewithal and prosperity, but also of the prospect of integrated personhood and conditions for a sustained sense of racial worth and dignity. It is equally important to remember, as part of the general historical background, that New World slavery was an enormity perpetrated not by barbarians of the European Middle Ages, but by modern, liberal, enlightened white people and their nation-states. Moreover, the regime of New World slavery was carried out with deliberate commercial self-interest and systematic political will and ideological and legal sanction, not over a decade or two, but over hundreds of years and across many generations. New World slavery, therefore, was not an anomaly, a monstrous deformity of Western modernity. Rather, it was constitutive of the very sinews of that modernity. It was a central pillar in the making of the modern world, so much so, in fact, that there are those who would argue that without slavery, some of the central values of Western modernity freedom, most especially, would scarcely have been possible, let alone salient. Consequently, the worlds of plantation slavery and of post-slavery are fundamentally, not incidentally, connected. And yet, even with this history, and even though the principle of reparatory justice has been widely accepted as a means of redressing historical injustices, the idea of reparations for New World slavery specifically remains at best controversial. Why is this? What racial disavowals disable black reparations? What racial conceits of innocence and immunity impair taking responsibility for that unjust and unredressed past? What presumptions of settled expectations and rights of property drive the will to normalize the racial capitalist status quo? In the remainder of this essay, I want to think about the moral justification of reparation for slavery by considering the work of one philosophic protagonist, namely Bernard Boxhill. Over many years now, Boxhill has been advancing in an exploratory way an argument concerning reparation for continental African Americans. This argument has Lockean sources. He is guided, he says, by the hope that such an approach, quote, will appeal to the critics of preferential treatment because many of them claim to be Lockeans, and Locke's moral and political philosophy is still the source of much American theorizing on social issues, unquote. What the implications of this starting point are is left to be seen. But part of what interests me about Boxhill is his determination not to be sidetracked by the large practical problems about the feasibility of reparations to peoples of African descent in the New World. What interests him, as indeed interests me, is the moral justification of the demand for reparation. A moral argument, he maintains, may justify demands for reparation that are in fact exorbitant or politically impossible to satisfy. But it is the justification, not the satisfaction, that concerns him. In considerations about reparation, it is important to push the moral argument where it leads and not be constrained by the seeming complexities concerning their possible realization. More importantly, though, for my purposes here, are the implications of his argument for thinking about the temporality of reparations. I shall read Boxhill, perhaps not uncontroversially, as offering a conceptualization of reparatory justice that does not tether the past to the future. That does not, in other words, require that the past mortgage its demands in order to avoid disrupting the dominant assumptions and expectations of those who benefit in the present from the racial past's injustice. The temporality of reparation. Boxhill first began to think systematically, and I see Angela sitting here, so this is a really important moment in some sense in the history of black and civil rights struggles in the continental US. Boxhill first began to think systematically about reparation in the wake of James Foreman's famous intervention in May 1969 when he marched into Riverside Church in New York City and read out the demands of his Black Manifesto. Because one considered a not unsympathetic objection to the reparatory demands embodied in Foreman's claims drew on a prospective argument about making the US a more and more egalitarian society. Boxhill has, in various iterations of his argument, spent some time clarifying a distinction between compensation and reparation, understood as parts of justice having different sources and objectives, and in consequence, different temporal orientations. Compensation, Boxill argues, is a broad term covering the general problem of alleviating disadvantages or losses or deficiencies a person suffers. Where compensation is appropriate, no injustice need have occurred. Compensation aims merely to enable someone who has suffered from some inadvertent circumstance, who has fallen on hard times, to gain or regain a competitive footing in her or his society. At the center of the idea of compensation from this point of view is a progressive commitment to equality of opportunity. Consequently, one might say that compensatory justice is a kind of distributive justice and therefore has a forward-looking orientation inasmuch as it is concerned to alleviate disabilities that stand in the way of prospective goods. Compensation aims to enhance life chances for more and more equitable future outcomes. Here then we have a conception of repair of a harmful past that is saturated with futurity. Boxill maintains, however, that what is owed to people of African descent in the New World cannot be remedied by compensation. Rather, the appropriate remedy is reparation. The case for reparation, Boxill says, is more primitive than that of compensation, in that it does not depend on the existence of a social contract, but only on the fact that everyone is equal in dignity and worth and therefore has an equal right to pursue and acquire what she or he values. For Boxill, reparation is part of what natural justice requires. By contrast with compensation, reparation is primarily backward-looking. It need not depend on any assumption about futurity. What sets it apart from compensation, conceptually, what narrows its focus of concern, is that the harm or disadvantage suffered in the past has not merely befallen the person. The harm is a result of an act of injustice. The aim of reparation is to repair the injury caused by this injustice. Thus, reparation need make no prospective claim about equality, only the retrospective claim that in fact a basic equality of dignity and worth has been transgressed by the past act of injustice, and indeed by the continuing neglect of its repair. An act of injustice in the past does not merely remain over time a dormant injustice. It ramifies as a consequence of its persisting on-repair. This is why Boxill argues that reparation does not simply entail a response to material dispossession or appropriation, and does not simply demand the return of what has been illegitimately taken, but requires also an acknowledgement of the harm caused. This is because the transgressed individual has not only been harmed, she or he has been wronged, that is, treated without due regard to their worth and dignity. As Boxill puts it, and I quote, "Without the acknowledgement of error, the injurer implies that the injured has been treated in a manner that befits him. Hence, he cannot feel that the injured party is his equal." Thus, it is not exactly that equality is irrelevant to reparation. It is that the future state of equality is irrelevant. Or as Rodney Roberts puts it in a similar idea in different but allied language, quote, "Rectification calls for an apology. Since restoration and compensation can address only unjust losses, an apology is necessary to effect rectification, because it is the apology that addresses the matter of righting the wrong of an injustice. What makes an injustice a wrong is the lack of respect shown when one's rights are violated. Hence, the righting of the wrong is accomplished by way of an apology, that is, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, which includes reaffirmation that those who suffered the injustice have moral standing," unquote. Whether or not compensation is due Black people as a means of creating more equal as a way of creating more equality in a social world with persisting structures of discrimination and disadvantage. Whether or not that is the case, what is unquestionable is that reparation is due to them in as much as they have been brought into their present situation as a consequence of a yet unrectified historical injustice. One can see then on this sketch of it that Boxhill's argument in favor of black reparation largely evades a forward-looking claim. Indeed, to my mind, part of what makes it worth thinking with, the details aside, is precisely that it is little concerned with reconciliatory considerations of any kind. For him, whatever the present owes to the future, a compensatory society of racial egalitarianism, the past owes something to the present, namely reparation for historical injustice. Now, to be sure, this is not an uncontroversial position. Take, for example, a philosophic critic like Jeremy Waldron, Kantian in his commitments to cosmopolitan rights of coexistence. He views reparation with a certain suspicion. For Waldron, people like Boxhill display an unhealthy obsession with the beleaguered and conflicted past and insufficient attention to the promise of an enlightened and unencumbered future. In two important and interconnected essays on the subject, his whole project is to so surround the idea of repairing the past with such crippling casuistry as to undermine its moral and conceptual force. Rights to reparation, he maintains, however justifiable they might appear at one historical moment, are capable of fading with the passage of time or with the emergence of new circumstances that effectively qualify, or rather disqualify, the earlier claim. Entitlement to historical repair, he says, may be superseded by more consequent present entitlements. For him, though, the fundamental problem with reparation arguments is that they disable our ability to simply move on, to let bygones be bygones. As he puts it, and I quote, "We must learn to come to terms with each other here and now, irrespective of how we all got here," unquote. But this begs the question, surely. Suppose how we got here is part of what keeps us in our subordinate position. Moreover, who is it that needs to come to terms with whom? And on what terms and conditions? And who finally decides this? What powers are at stake here? What is troubling about forward-looking arguments such as Waldron's is that they appear to depend on the assumption, sometimes aggressively articulated, as in his case, that the settled expectations, that's his phrase, the settled expectations of the beneficiaries of historical injustice, typically, of course, whites, ought not to be tampered with or infringed upon. For Waldron, notably, what really counts is not so much the scope of the social suffering of the violated or the subjugated, but the extent to which the status quo of the propertied, however ill-gotten, will be disrupted. The settled present, in other words, ought to protect itself against the unresolved claims from the past. But can one resolve the past without disrupting the present? What hegemonies determine what kind of disruption is morally agreeable and morally egregious? Even a sympathetic philosophic critic such as Jana Thompson, who disagrees instructively with Waldron on many issues, feels the need to qualify reparatory obligations with concessions to the present state of affairs. Reparatory entitlements, she says, are only entitlements, all things being equal, quote unquote. This is so because rival obligations can come into conflict with each other, and this is especially hard to avoid where obligations are historical, she writes, and I quote, "Accepting an obligation to return land stolen by our predecessors," and the pronouns here, the possessive pronouns are important. "Accepting an obligation to return land stolen by our predecessors forces us to make a decision about how we treat the entitlements of those who are now in possession, if these entitlements exist. Fulfilling reparatory obligations may clash with a duty to make our society more equitable for all citizens, unquote. And this dilemma is partly why Thompson thinks that reparations should, in the end, be embedded in a future-oriented reconciliatory approach to historical injustice. She writes, and I quote again, "By insisting that reparation is owed for past injustices, this defense of historical obligation is backward-looking. But the justification contains forward-looking considerations. The existence of historical obligations is predicated on our moral relations to our successors. This way of thinking about historical obligations affects how we judge particular demands for reparations, and it provides a reason for accepting the reconciliatory approach to reparatory justice," unquote. But again, the question remains, who decides how to balance these claims? What powers of property, for example, shape which obligations are taken to be paramount and which obligations are taken to be subordinate? In Boxill, by contrast, I don't see that reconciliation plays any role in his argument for black reparation. To be sure, Boxill and others, such as Rodney Roberts and Angelo Corlett, insist that apology is indispensable for reparation. For them, the wrong in the harm can only be redressed by an acknowledgement on the part of the perpetrators or their descendants or beneficiaries of the injustice of the actions that gave rise to the unresolved state of affairs. But nothing in this obliges them to positively embrace the forward-looking considerations of reconciliation. The worry may well be, as demonstrated by the positions taken variously by Waldron and Thompson, that in the clash between rival obligations, it is the settled expectations of the propertied status quo in the present that will prevail and foreclose the rectification of the past's injustice. Certainly, African Americans are no strangers to the demand that they lay aside their claims on the past in order to keep faith in the promise of an egalitarian future to come. However abstractly appealing that might be, philosophers like Boxill seem to me justified in not hanging their argument for moral justification for reparation for slavery on its historical prospect. Summarizing. So, here is what I've been trying to say in these provisional notes on post-slavery black futurity and reparative justice. I begin with the admission that futurity is now fugitive, no longer self-evident, barely imaginable. I take this to be an attempt to face up to the new conjuncture that defines our present. In a fundamental way, I believe, the center of gravity of our temporal organization of our lives has shifted. Our temporal confusion, as I suggested, stems partly from the fact that the old modernist organization of time, the progressivist rhythm in which past, present, and future followed one another in predictable succession, has not simply vanished. Fragments continue to exist in more or less haphazard form, with more or less generational attachment. But although these fragments of that older organization of time still persist cognitively, so to speak, they no longer add up to a coherent moral frame of temporal experience and expectation. This is the sense in which, as I keep saying, the time is tragically out of joint. I believe, moreover, that one of the casualties of the collapse of progressivist time is the experience and expectation of post-slavery black futurity as a time of freedom-making. I believe that one dimension of the stalled sense of time is precisely illuminated in the legacy of the slave past in the post-slave present. The story of slave emancipation has been an exemplary story of modernist futurities, but it is now no longer clear how to reimagine the horizon of black freedom, and how to activate the social momentum by which to get us all the way there from where we are here. I believe, though, that reparatory justice, not as the realization of a normative ideal or the affirmation of a new phase of Enlightenment reason or international morality, but as the name uttered in a tragic key of a simple moral demand, opens an ethical cognitive space in which to linger without haste with the ghosts of slavery. This is why, on the one hand, Bernard Boxill interests me, and why, on the other, Jeremy Waldron seems to me so complacently and symptomatically complicit with the settled arrangements of power and property of white supremacy. Let bygones be bygones, Waldron urges, so that we might embrace each other in a reconciliatory spirit of future-oriented Kantian cosmopolitanism. Boxill seems to me wary of the cheerful sense of futurity this stance depends on. For him, I think, the past is a more burdensome time, more bitter even, less amenable to rational ordering, rational forgetting. In his moral philosophy, past injustice is not merely over and done with. The black dead are not merely dead. They impose a yet unfulfilled duty to repair the harms they endured for the sake of a future that would not be theirs. Where Waldron urges us to leave the dead to bury the dead and to turn our attention to a certain future, Boxill seems to suggest that there is no future without the repair of that past. I don't deny that reparatory politics, such as I have been describing them here, might be liberal politics. I don't affirm that they are, note, but I am not certain that they don't partake of a liberal imagination. I don't know, for example, whether Boxill invokes Locke's second treatise for deep reasons and commitments or for merely strategic ones. Nor do I know what hangs on being able to decide this one way or the other. At least as I want to describe them here, and I grant it is a motivated description. Post-slavery reparatory politics are not necessarily concerned with the compensatory transformation of the larger economic and political framework of black social existence. Post-slavery reparatory politics does not necessarily aim to transform our collective futures. It does not necessarily address itself explicitly to a progressive or utopian future. Rather, and more modestly, it interrupts old ideas of futurity deliberately. It refuses what it perceives as the easy conceits of futurity's desire to dissolve the past. It wonders aloud whether, given that post-emancipation black futurities haven't yet arrived, have been a long time coming, seem now indefinitely postponed, it might not be time to bracket the progressive demand to race into the future and to pause and inhabit our collective disenchantment. After all, why shouldn't we believe that the demand to commit to the future isn't another trick of white supremacist politics? Why shouldn't we ask, what is the cost of the future in the currency of the past? Since futures need pasts to animate their intelligibility as well as their sensibility, what pasts are these that we will be obliged to embrace? Therefore, I am not interested in rescuing a new future from the past. I hold that post-slave reparatory justice may well be a justifiable form of disenchantment, a provisional refusal to strive to reanimate the future until the past has been rectified. It may be that post-slave black futures, whatever they may be, are inconceivable or anyway not worthwhile without a mode of reparatory address to the past. For post-slave reparatory justice bears witness to the past's abject persistence and to the many betrayals of former futures. Admittedly, therefore, reparatory justice is not directly a black freedom project in the mode of former liberation projects. Admittedly, with regret, it defers freedom. It is a present demand for neither equality nor fairness. It is a demand for what is owed, for what was taken, and a demand for recognition that an unspeakable and unforgivable injustice was perpetrated, and that this gives rise to a debt and justifies an entitlement. Thank you.